So there's this problem every time I try and start writing about my favorite Zelda game, Majora's Mask. I can tell you many things that I like about it, and I've worked on a script and may even still make that video someday, but it always, without fail, reaches the point where I'm grasping at the darkness of my brain, trying to come up with a way to really meaningfully put to words what I feel when I play it. It's not fun in the classical sense. It's not the kind of entertainment that I know how to articulate, really. Like, okay, you do bad shit in Radiant Dawn, but I like that game, and it's entertaining because you see these characters make grim, miserable choices, and your intervention in the story is mostly just playing Fire Emblem itself. Or, like, even something like Resident Evil 4, which is technically horror, feels exhilarating. You're running for your life, but you're also enjoying the raw pleasure of shooting Spanish zombies. In contrast, everything I'm doing in Majora's Mask is overshadowed by the anxiety of constantly needing to do something. Things that you're going to do just to help these people feel a little better in the last 30 days of their life. And these things do earn you mechanical benefits, items, heart pieces, masks, but I can't reconcile it. I can't get over the gloom soaked into this world, tainting every encounter. I still remember being a child, not knowing how to progress on this game's first day, where you're stuck, transformed into this miserable, haunted-looking Deku scrub, hearing the moon rattle the very bones of the town as the sky grows from gentle, placid black and dark blues to one tainted red as the moon gets closer and closer. This track, this track always sends me back to that scared, crying child, unable to tell my parents that this game I've been looking forward to more than anything had terrified me in a way that I didn't know how to describe. The sheer helplessness of it all, of trying and pushing and helping while being unable to be helped. And still, a critic who adamantly refuses to pick favorite books, games, musicians, fruit. If I was asked point blank what my favorite Zelda is, I could tell you it was this one, every time without fail. The last time I beat it, something that should have been triumphant, ending the trauma of my childhood by proving that I could do it, it wasn't. No, it lives in my head, creeping into me, making me feel small and scared. And there's something captivating in that, in its transformative capacity, a way to feel something maybe genuinely profound. For a long time, I thought this game was some kind of anomaly of my childhood, this grim beast in my head casting a shadow over my more mundane interests. And I find myself here, looking down the barrel of Echo, the 18-plus furry visual novel. Echo and Majora's Mask are obviously very different games, but like said Zelda title, this game has haunted me. Like, a year after I finished my first playthrough, Leo's Path, I still couldn't stop thinking about it. And now, I need to know why this game still lingers in my head, why I sometimes cannot bear the memory of it, and why I think it's also one of the best games I've ever played. Before I actually begin, I want to be upfront. Echo is a violent horror game. There's a lot of sexual content, some of it kind of spicy, some really, really explicit. I'm not showing anything about that here, Mr. YouTube, so please don't destroy me or whatever, but I will be talking about this, all of this. Some of the things that happened are incredibly disturbing, and if you're sensitive to those, discussions of sexual violence, torture, descriptions of violence in pretty intimate detail, this may not be the video for you. I'm sorry. Similarly, if you have even a passing interest in playing this yourself, I will be talking about spoilers for this game. I have these warnings up front as I do all my videos, but it is worth repeating in this case. Please be safe. Now, here, at the surface of the lake, so to speak, Echo is, at least according to its fan wiki, a deconstruction of a dating sim visual novel. If you're familiar with the genre, you can see the signs pretty early on. Chase is our point-of-view character, coming back to his hometown of Echo, a mostly desolate little town deep in the desert. He's working on a school project, doing a report on Echo's weird happenings 100 years ago, and is using this week to also have a reunion with the remnants of his old friend group, setting you up on your possible dating candidates. You have Leo, Chase's old ex-boyfriend, Carl, the rich kid stoner, TJ, the meek, overly religious youngest member of the group, Jenna, a native girl who used to live in the reservation, and Flynn, my favorite of the group, and fuck you guys so much. Now, as you may be able to piece together, what with all the warnings and wistful nonsense about Majora's Mask, this isn't your ordinary horny furry VN, and things take a pretty significant turn into horror nightmares no matter whose path you venture down. Now, because of its recent pop culture significance, recent as in like, I don't know, everyone was playing it a few years ago, I'm going to preempt everyone who's about to say to themselves, or worse, to me in the comments, that this is like Doki Doki Literature Club, which is a horny anime VN that takes a sharp turn into horror. And my answer to that is no. No, it is not. Okay, I'm not going to spend forever talking about it. I do get why people want to draw the connection. They are superficially similar. They lure you in with vivid characters and the promise of engaging in the kind of fun a dating sim has to offer, and then it snaps into horror. And they both even use meta-breaking mechanics to amplify said horror elements in varying degrees. But that's where the similarities stop kind of outright. DDLC's focus in its horror is purely mechanical. The story about a girl who realizes she's a video game character who starts to use the game's programming to force you to date her, driving the other three characters into becoming their worst selves to isolate you before downright deleting them out of the game entirely. The horror is using the game itself as a tool to make you feel unsafe. Deleting save files, manipulating choices, cutting in violent imagery and text loop breaks, deleting itself off your system once you beat it, and you can beat DDLC. It's a horror game front and center, using the veneer of a dating sim before everything peels away into mechanics and abstraction. Echo, on the other hand, uses the very nature of the dating sim to immerse you into its horror, rather than pulling the rug out from under you. The premise, a furry dating sim, is a weird one to use because furries are weird kind of by nature. They sit at this very particular intersection of human and animal features that can make folks not in the community, so to speak, feel taken entirely out of the game's verisimilitude. It's hard to feel really connected to a story when you're not looking at human people, at least in theory. Actually, hold on. I'm going to pause here and talk about furry culture. So, taking it from me, someone who has made a video speculating on my position in furry culture, but has been in at least one furry community or other for, 16 years by now. I worry that we're not going to get further in this before I don't know, talk about furry stuff. Like, furry culture is a weird thing to, summarize or whatever. Partly, maybe even primarily, due to just how wildly diverse it is. I hesitate to say many definitive things about it, but from my experience, it's a weird identity group to approach. You know how there's a community built around interests, like sports or nerd stuff or whatever Age of Empires does to people. And there are also groups built around shared inherent qualities of who you are, like being Hispanic or trans or a gamer. The furry community travels in both kinds, interest communities and identity communities, with very little to really pull these things apart from one another. Liking furry art, or those old Looney Tunes cartoons, or finding Leo hot kind of wraps you into the community to some degree, but that community is also full of people for whom the concept holds a fundamental kind of meaning to us. Them, whatever. This creates a tension in trying to talk about furry stuff in such broad ways, depending on your relative awareness and interest in this kind of stuff. You know, it can be weird to see that quite a lot of fiction in the community cares quite a lot about the way these characters operate in this world as the species they are. Echo draws on this escapist desire in furry spaces to have that connection to this world. The writers are closer to the identity camp than the interest one. With this in mind, the differences in intent from one game to the other becomes clearer. Both games are made with full awareness of their audience. DDLC straightforwardly courts two groups: people who are into horny anime dating sims, and people who like fucked up surprise meta horror. And the game makes narrative elisions, cuts around having to explain itself in clear terms. The idea is that if you're into anime dating, you don't need to explain the concept of four girls who are hot for you, nameless, faceless, self-insert protagonist. And if you're into jump scare horror, part of the nature of the genre is in the jump scare. You know, you want to be taken off guard. These illusions build a distancing effect on the player, pulling you away from seeing these characters as real, so to speak. Your main point of tension with the game necessarily buffers you away from developing a closeness to these characters, and do so with the goal of making your own agency feel violated. It's sad when Yuri dies, when Natsuki's taken control of, but it invests the bulk of its emotional punch firstly in Sayori's suicide, which happens like halfway through the game, and then she's deleted from the game, and now it's just the game messing with you via these abstractions. And of course, you don't have to write your game like this, like even if it is an anime dating sim turned horror experience, but DDLC did, and those illusions, that distancing, I think, detracts from it. That big emotional punch it has right at the turning point is powerful, but it's immediately pulled out from under you, and you're left with a very surface level scare of her not even being in the game anymore. Its interest in meta horror ultimately consumes its capacity for depth. Echo, on the other hand, relishes in its own immersion. Specifically, the effort put into properly realizing the world is the fundamental difference between Echo and DDLC, and also DDLC is kind of bad, I'm sorry. The game puts a genuine effort into incorporating these bodies, species, people into it. Species features, the catchphrase used within the friend group to stop the roughhousing from using particular parts of each other's bodies that are unique to their species, feels like a goofy, silly thing at first, but it's woven into the history of these friends who have grown up together. Things like scent neutralizers, worrying about different fur types, horn bands, weird hookup prejudices, fetishizing, even the Jesus species debate are worked into the text and setting and background knowledge of everyone. And most important to this equation is that this isn't a weighty thing where the game has to, sit you down and explain to you that everyone's an animal person in order to establish things and create conflict like Beastars or Zootopia. You have clicked on the Furry visual novel game. You have, presumably, already made your peace with the fact that the world is going to be like this. Pairing this with the game's already strong effort to focus on minutia, on the details, the temperature, colors, quality of the air, smells, as well as, in the more horrific moments, Chase's particular shortcomings and danger, his stubby legs, his clumsiness getting him injured by accident or otherwise. Horror in this game isn't frequently attached to supernatural nightmare monsters, creatures with black spots for eyes, looping highways and hallways, but often in the palpable detailing of violence, the main culprit at the heart of Echo. So, for this immersion to twist and wind and work itself into you, and you in turn into these characters, as someone whose relationship with furry stuff, we're getting distracted here. Immersion. Most of my efforts to pin this game down conflict with its ideas and choices overlapping, blending, and expounding imperfectly, seemingly hinging on the internal flaws of the friend group itself. Everything they try to do always goes wrong. However, why? Why these paths are so distinct, more than just genre exploration or their own bespoke ideas, is that the heart of each focus character, their worst selves, their worst insecurities and desires, soak into the narrative itself and reflects bizarrely onto Chase. At the beginning of the story, before the path splits, Flynn snaps at the others at the river, close to the lake where the final friend of the group, Sydney, died in front of TJ. And in this scene, Flynn lists out everyone's worst flaws, including Chase, you, how you appraise everyone quietly, observing, judging, accusing Chase of wanting to tore through each of the others for sex, which is our first real meta nod. And that speech, happening right before the paths split, serves as the lodestar through this game. Everyone's worst selves, cruelest tendencies will be put in excruciating detail in at least one of these paths. Yes, even Chase. On a technical level, the game's sense of how to use its genre shines through. Frustratingly for me, Echo has no problems laying out the mechanical functions, the lore, the world, almost blatantly by the time you get through every path. It's a trope in horror I often find frustrating, in that it often serves as a crutch to put distance between you and your visceral experience with what you went through. Sure, Five Nights at Freddy's is really scary, but it doesn't stop people from theory crafting endlessly about it in a way that kind of pushes back the visceral fear. I think with Echo, though, knowing things about the town can really only take you so far. That's why I resist making this video a lore explanation, outside of my usual distaste for lore stuff. You can know why and what's happening, who the player character actually is, the truth about the monsters, the tulpas, but the violence doesn't get to have absolution. Echo is ultimately generous in what it lets you know about it, but it refuses to pull away from the violence, the sickening details overwhelming the logical pieces falling into place. You can know why Brian chains you down on his BDSM table and nearly chokes you to death for his own gratification, but you are still going to have to see it happen. Echo wants to immerse you into this world, through its attention to detail, through that same attention getting weaponized against you when the violence starts, but it is a deconstruction of the dating sim, and stories like these, told in first person, have a particular affinity towards the player naturally reflecting themselves into the main character, the easiest point of immersion a video game can afford you. I wonder if Echo does anything weird with that. I need to, before we go further than the shallows here, put it down that I was dreading Leo's path so much. I can't, at the time of writing this particular passage, weigh in on whether or not it's the most extremely violent and fucked up. Like, it's more intense than Carl's, which I'm about to put myself through. But reaching the end of Leo's story, I was confronted with a kind of horrible part of my psyche. Something likely born from my bad self-esteem that liking someone, wanting their friendship, their affection, leads me to doing things utterly destructive to myself in sacrifice of that. I stop everything I'm doing to respond to messages as soon as possible. If I don't respond, I feel overwhelming guilt and paralytic anxiety over not knowing what to say or being worried about sounding uninterested or uncaring, and that tendency got exposed and agitated throughout that playthrough, and it was just agonizing to reach the end and feel so viscerally the crushing pain of letting go, of hurting someone because you needed to. The only charitable feeling I could have had to myself this time around was the generosity to say that when I got the bad ending the first time, I chose that answer hoping to get Leo on the train and get him help. It feels nice to say out loud, but it's just a prettier way to say the same problem all over again. And even now, even as my relationship with relationships has changed, I can look back and see the part of me that feels the childhood anxiety of hard conversations and how whenever people are upset, I've always said hurtful things, and that sensation just builds and builds up in my brain, and I can't handle it. I can't handle conflict, and this path made use of that pain and my own capacity for thoughtlessness. Hopefully that doesn't come back to haunt me later in this video. This, I believe, established the point of friction I have with this part of the deconstruction. Echo is not the first to play with the idea of the self-insert character in a narrative as a character viscerally distinct from you, the player, but it takes a particular interest in playing with this tension. Flynn and Jenna's roots respectively help to clarify your function in this game as one of the supernatural parts of Echo, partly because Jenna's efforts on constructing a logical answer to this world and Flynn's fixation with the truth bleed into their respective paths, but the answer itself, much like how the horror of violence works, can really only get you so far. Like, you're the ghost of Samuel Ayres, who died many, many years ago, and by jumping from body to body, you affect the decisions people can sometimes make, but that kind of doesn't matter, right? Like, it's interesting lore, it's fine connective tissue for the story's sake, but in the moment, in the depths of each of these parts, you're not really thinking about this, are you? Like, that's not how this works. You're looking at Leo and Chase, and without thinking about it, this entire situation just starts to grate into your soul. Chase has fucked up. Leo is fucked up, but you wanted to see this, to get to know him, to maybe even love him, and it feels like the game is punishing you for that want, because all it does is make things spiral harder and harder between them until, if you know what needs to happen, you can escape and break their hearts, and maybe even your own, and are rewarded with the bitterest of hopeful endings that maybe, finally, Leo can move on. This sensation was all but confirmed through Carl's path, which was nicer, but it felt like the progression of the game was going to be that the game was using Chase to speak about you and your intentions with these characters, but then I went to TJ's path. Here, following the final scavenger hunt the late Sydney made for everyone started to reveal the thing that TJ and Chase could never let come to light. The truth of Sydney's murder. The stress and anxiety and anger of it all warps you, Chase, to his worst self. Urged on by a twisted mirror reflection, Chase alienates all of his friends, forges a scavenger clue, pinning the blame on Flynn and Carl, and out of a wild fit of jealousy and possessiveness, Chase tries to force himself on TJ, pushing him away too in the process. The path culminates in Chase, your point of view, finding Flynn confronting TJ at the lake where Sydney died, where Chase proceeds to drown Flynn, just like he did with Sydney, promising to a shell-shocked TJ that he'll look out for him just as before. All of this, obliterated that connection. If Leo's path was built to lure you in and show you that you cannot just repair this relationship because you want Leo, and you can't coax Carl into a relationship because he needs to find himself, and that explicitly means not relying on you, TJ's path warps your connection viscerally, reflected in the horrible mirror man warping Chase's facial features, leaving you violently divorced from him, inhabiting his body as a passenger and merely witnessing him kill again for TJ. Jesus fucking Christ. This path, by this point in my journey, so thoroughly poisoned my relationship to my self-insert here that I couldn't fathom what could possibly happen next. I wanted Chase to die. I almost hated being in his fur. It was almost a shame too, because I did Jenna's next, and though her path is violent and horrible, and you see so much of the horrors of the town, you learn about the hum, the wave of madness that wells up from the town and creeps into everyone's heads, about the strange socket man that Jenna's been seeing every now and then as a kid, a burning creature with holes for eyes and a mouth that seems to appear in the worst moments. He was there in Leo's path. He even saves you from Brian, the sex torturer in this one. You find the haunted van, you learn about Sam, you get the one thing you kind of wanted out of Leo's path here, with him finally recognizing that he grew obsessive over Chase and he couldn't handle not having things work out the way he wanted them to. And in the good ending of this path, everything kind of works out. Like, all of your friends get out, you have a new friend in the group, you save Echo, if you told Jenna you're bi at the beginning, you could even potentially have a relationship with her in the future, maybe. Like, it's kind of the most feel-good ending, and I couldn't even enjoy it. It felt fake, too good for this guy that I'm forced to live in, and I'm sure if I did this path earlier, I could maybe feel comforted by the reason that underpins Jenna's route, giving me the release of the burden of bearing the game's pointed interest in twisting my desires against me, but by this point the damage was kind of done. And then it was Flynn's turn. Here is where this connection to your self-insert is stressed to its limit. Partway through Flynn's path, where it feels like this time the game wants to draw sharp attention to the callous desire to cycle through everyone for sex, like Flynn accuses you of, he finds out the truth. He manages to confront TJ fairly, enough to get him to explain what happened, which led to Chase being outed as Sydney's killer to the entire group. In a panic, he runs off into the reading room and into a nest of Black Widow spiders, which led to a scene that I had to blur through because I have a big phobia for this stuff. But it culminates in a perspective shift for the rest of the game. You are now Flynn. You see his flashbacks in his head. You see Sydney's past, his father killing himself in the woods, how Flynn helped Sydney bury the body to keep the secret safe, how this bonded the two together, and then you eventually find and rescue Chase from Spider Hell, and Chase is, like, here now, as a character, like Flynn was, and you're fully out of his head. He acts, according to himself and everyone, more like himself. And as the town's hysteria starts to build and build, and your path winds through what feels like a grand tour of the other events, you try to escape Echo, and you run into the Socket Man, who crashes you all into Lake Emma. This suddenly forces Flynn into a hallucination of the smoke room, the unofficial dubbing of the free-for-all gay sex club he goes to, the one you visited what felt like centuries ago when you were Chase. Here, you meet a version of Sydney now grown up, and you have a pleasant construction of what life could have been like if he had lived. Flynn catches on immediately that this can't be real, but the truth he so desperately seeks behind the door to the smoke room itself leads him into the mine that Chase almost died in back in Leo's path, the mine that was the site of the first wave of hysteria, and now it's on fire, and you, Flynn, Sam, all of you, merge together as Flynn's body burns and warps his desire to find the truth, dooming him to become the Socket Man, to untether himself from time and space and canon, to warp about, being the monster that has saved and terrorized everyone. At the end of it all, two guys doing a report on the town run into a burnt-out Chase, who lives in Echo now, utterly lost by what happened that night, with Flynn's warped body still haunting the mines to this day. Flynn's path here, beyond how it shifts your dynamic with Chase, does something else interesting. See, sometimes in visual novels, in dating sims, in stories with branching pathways, there is often effort put into making a golden path, or a way through the story that gives the player the greatest sense of closure. One of the difficulties in branching stories is that saying yes to someone means saying no to everyone else, and that casts a bittersweet shade over anything you do if you're the type of person who feels such things, like me. Echo doesn't do this. It rejects this entirely. The idea of these being stories that are built on predicting your expectations and desires through your expressed choices and playing on them starts to fall away as the story pieces itself together through each path. The emotions I've been accruing through this all, my relationship to Chase, to the others, to the town itself, grew and festered within me. I've hated Chase and Echo with all my heart, and I've begged silently for a way to save them both. The story puts itself together through exploring every path, seeing everything from every angle, each path filling in a comprehensive layout of all the elements you'd need to know to get it. Leo's obsession, the history of Carl's family, the events at Lake Emma, the Hum, Tulpas, the Socket Man, but you cannot get the full story without being forced to realize that the game rejects comprehensive closure. Flynn's story establishes that you cannot have a canon ending, a golden path, and the closest you could achieve to closure would be through Jenna, which leaves it clear that there's no way to fix the town. The only way to be safe is to leave Echo. Now, Echo itself is not a perfect text. The culmination of every part has kind of complicated my goals with this essay, and I don't think that was done deliberately. I initially titled this piece Escapism Hell, based on working through Leo and Carl's paths first, and the actual heart of the game, the way it complicates and strains and pulls your efforts to map yourself onto Chase, don't really come through in those. It creates a very specific effect that comes off as judgmental, that you're kind of bad for trying to force a relationship on Leo or Carl, both of whom have pretty solid reasons that said relationship just wouldn't work out. But in the other paths, it's more clear that Chase is a character in every way that the others are, and that your intervention is much more limited, that you can share his experiences, feel the slimy pond water on your fur, even sway his thoughts in some critical places. But you are not him. And clarifying that relationship changes the dynamic with Leo and Carl in a way that those paths weren't able to do themselves. So, back when I was talking about my own capacity for thoughtlessness, yeah, it turns out the game really only does that one time, and I think even then it would only read that way if Leo's the first person you choose, and I'd say that here, like, obviously you pick Leo first, look at how hot he is, but I do have a couple of friends who picked TJ first, so I don't know. And yet, the totality of the experience works. It should be simple, right? Like, it's not a perfect game, sure, but the missteps were interesting and deeply affecting in their own right. I still feel like shit thinking about Leo. And if it were just this, if it was just a vividly written, intricate, thoughtful horror game about shame, small-town homophobia, cultural struggles, religious friction, it would all be still very good, easily one of the best games I've ever played, among the ranks of Disco Elysium, but it's been days now, and I can't stop crying. And I think that we need to talk about Flynn. We've gone pretty deep into the lake by now, and I need to give a heads up that there's a lot of important and frank discussion of intimate things ahead. Just, take care going forward. There's a sequence before the shifting of your point of view through the story, back when the path seemed to be fixated more on messing with Chase and your interests in having sex with his friends. Flynn starts this path demanding that you leave him alone, lashing out, seemingly violent, but he never follows through, always caving and finally quietly admitting that he's frustrated. He feels like TJ's hiding something from him, and he doesn't know what it is, and every time you make choices for Chase, Flynn looks at him awkwardly, like he's seeing something that isn't there. Like, this behavior of him lashing out and then opening up as Chase keeps standing his ground and prying escalates to Flynn kind of abruptly initiating an intimate encounter a little away from the fishing spot he took you and Carl to. From there, you both agree that it's maybe a bad idea, but later, you go back to his place and have sex, only to that morning deal with Leo trying to track you both down, causing Chase to hide in the bathroom and dissociate. After finding out more things about the town's history for Chase's homework, you return to Flynn's place, where he receives a cryptic message and leaves abruptly. You, Carl, and Flynn's roommate Daxton find his phone open to a message that's just an address. That's when you get to the smoke room. This is the only path in the game that takes you here, to a place no one else knows. Not Carl, not Leo. It has no real name, just a cryptic sign cheekily welcoming you into Echo's potentially only gay bar. Carl waits outside, Daxton finds an Ad Astra fan, and Flynn, after berating you for following him, coyly passes on a message for you to enter the smoke room, the room inside the bar. The smoke room proper is a free-for-all dark room, and it is here that you encounter Flynn, and you can choose to have sex with him again. You share an intimate moment with him in the populated room, and as the encounter continues, some anonymous men intrude to have sex with you both. Flynn begs you to stay, to keep going, but you don't get an option here. Chase cannot handle this part of Flynn's life, this secret, his forays to this anonymous sex club that no one in his regular life knows anything about, a secret that he's been so clearly ashamed of, and now, with you back in town, even though he knows he shouldn't, knowing that Leo would get irrationally upset, that you're leaving town anyway in a few days, he takes a wild risk and invites you in to know him truly and completely. Chase rejects this, and their relationship never again gets this close. So, Flynn is me. Not really. Like, I didn't grow up in a small town. I never went clubbing. I've never gone to the smoke room. I wasn't even really aggressive and standoffish and mean to my friends. At least, not like that. But that moment in the smoke room where Flynn is bearing everything finally at once to Chase, finally letting him see the part of him he could never share, that there was something so deeply, profoundly, sickeningly ingrained into his core, this burning, choking shame, to be finally seen, to feel like he could really be known by him. I've never done what Flynn did, but I have been in that room, in that town, with that weight in my heart, just wanting to find someone else, something meaningful in this. So, remember when I said that I've been in furry spaces for 16 years? Yeah, I'm not going to give details. Those details are private, and even if they were appropriate for YouTube, I will not disclose this stuff. It's mine. But these spaces hit me at a vulnerable age, and while I remained physically safe, I spent a lot of time bearing the emotional weight of, I guess you could call it digital intimacy. This started before I started to transition, and the way I negotiated this part of my life was as a gay guy, and that defined my, like, relationship with intimacy. And that, by virtue of many complex reasons, most of which I will not get into, put me in a position where I couldn't talk to anyone about it. And it's been, I just, I don't know. This was 7 years of my life. I forged friendships that are with me to this day, a boatload of complexes and unhealthy relationships with myself, and then I transitioned. Uh, I'm still in these spaces. I'm still here, but I'm not that person anymore, and I never will be. I feel haunted by that version of me, that lost kid adrift in a world that they were maybe not ready for. Transition has improved so many things in my life, but like, remember when I talked about my singing voice in my Transistor video, how transitioning after puberty, after losing the voice I grew up loving, has left behind a ghost in my throat of what I used to sound like? It's kind of like that. There's an entire neural memory of what being close to someone feels like. And it's this construct that doesn't have room for who I am now. I spent some time a few months ago talking about the catgirl stuff, my streamer model, my like internet identity, how I feel like I've been masking my mental health and harboring these secrets for so long that I've pretended myself into a half creature. It's an identity that I've been able to describe as painfully accurate. I feel seen, but it doesn't feel good, if that makes sense. It's not gender or species euphoria as much as it is a fitting truth to who I am. And the thing that I've danced around in this moment, in that old video, within my private life, is the sinking terror that this double life has been something so deeply connected to who I am, the very thing I've spent my life hiding in shame over. Can something that has changed you, maybe even traumatized you, be a source of joy in itself? And if so, am I holding on to the shame for its own sake because it feels like I should be ashamed of this part of myself, even though it too has the capacity for beauty and meaning and fulfillment? I want to backstep here a little bit because it can come off like I'm accusing the furry fandom as a nightmare place that messed me up, when it was the circumstances, the internet, the lack of knowledge of how to be safe. Becoming a furry was the landing point here, but back in the day, and arguably still to this day now, the internet is not a safe space for young folks, almost full stop. And indulging in this capacity to find and create digital communities have led people all over to all sorts of things, from relatively mundane interests in like Final Fantasy or Hamtaro to communities that can foster deep, lasting harm to your psyche, like becoming an incel or a white nationalist or a Fire Emblem fan. It's not really the fault of the community itself that I'm like this, and that's maybe where the source of the tension has come from. Trauma in itself is a weird thing to talk about. And part of that is maybe because a bunch of kids online have learned these terms and are calling stuff like being affectionate in a relationship love bombing. You know, the thing an abuser does in a relationship to manipulate their victim into staying with them. I think another complication here is that trauma itself more describes a phenomenon and not strictly the intensity of it happening. It's the shifting and deepening of our understanding of the process that happened with the term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The phrase entered into relative popularity in the 70s to describe the psychological effect of the Vietnam War on US veterans, and that specific connotation had the effect of overshadowing other sources of trauma in popular culture and common understanding. To say that I've been traumatized feels on some level like dramatic hyperbole, but I have internalized so much guilt and shame and stress over my involvement in these spaces for over half my life that it has shaped my relationship to intimacy itself around it, to say nothing about the identity stuff I was going on about earlier. The effects of my actions as a teen have done something pretty substantial to me, call it trauma or not, and opening up about it online, it's not a great move, but it felt necessary. Echo has shown me that these experiences are not only solely my own, but that there is meaning to be found. That these spaces that have cast the shameful gloom over my life are also places of beauty, of joy. It strains the mind to be so touched by something that I've spent days crying over it, and that something lives directly inside my shameful, secret double life. Fully confronting all of this at the bottom of our metaphorical lake has left me with this longing for the world of Echo itself, and a shocking amount of love for our central cast. It's been days now since I finished, and after many, many days of crying over Flynn, I'm finally at a place where I have bonded with them all. And it's not an easy place to be in. In case you haven't been paying attention, these aren't the most morally pristine gaggle of furries. I've been hanging out on the Discord server for this and the rest of Echo Project's games, and I've noticed a tendency that makes a lot of sense in discussions of this game, where people spend a lot of time and energy litigating these characters' faults among themselves, either to justify or vilify one of them, usually Chase or Leo or Jenna. I think that it's hard to come to terms with characters like these. The last game I spent a lot of time with that had characters this thought out was Disco Elysium, and that benefited from having kind of a disconnect between you and our amnesiac player character. His flaws and tragedies were part of the things you're discovering as you play it, but your journey through Echo is through a point of view character who reveals things to you he already knows about himself. We've already discussed the game's interest in playing with your relationship to your point of access character Chase, but I think it has a deeper effect in creating a distance that compels you to see him alongside the others in the group. So I want to be clear here. Every member of this group has done some bad shit as a kid that has stuck with and changed who they grew up into. And oh no, it's just like the thing I said earlier. Oops. The thing is, beyond the fact that these are fictional characters, and you can just like a fictional character and not endorse drowning someone in a lake or something. These characters were kids. This tragedy happened, and TJ hadn't even hit double digits yet. Like, trauma, right? Like, some part of them never got to grow up properly from that point on, because it was all they could do to keep each other safe and together. But the game specifically denies the framing of these characters as wholly good. If you find these characters, their struggles, their hopes, their flaws meaningful to you, you're free to do so. And isn't that kind of liberating? I find it more enriching to come to know these characters this intimately and find in my heart the capacity to love them more than any kind of heartwarming platitudes about tragically flawed but fundamentally good people. Like, not to discard heartwarming, affirming art. I mean, hell, I love Final Fantasy, and those games are filled with boundless love for their protagonists, but as someone who's negotiating her small but growing internet presence, I found myself blessed with people with no shortage of positive things to tell me, and I'm the monster that can't really accept praise. Certainly not so broadly and apropos of nothing. It's maybe one of my most sickening traits. Lucky to have genuinely wonderful people in my life, and too depressed to appreciate it. That being said, Echo undeniably did something to me. It tugged at a hidden depth in my life and drew it out. It made me relive the feelings I had growing up before I transitioned, before I came to terms with who I am, why intimacy scares me, what may actually be going on with my head. Like Leo, part of me looks back at my past and wonders if I've genuinely lost something that made me more likable, made my life make more sense. And like Leo, I have people from that past still just around in my life. But they're different, and I'm different. And there's nothing really to be done about that. To escape into this world may not include taking on the burdens of Chase and Flynn as your own, but to live in a world that both needs secrets and cannot fully contain them. It invites you into the lives of 6 people forced to reckon with themselves under extreme duress and somehow bafflingly find a sense of beauty in the process. There's a power to Echo denying us a canon ending or a golden path in that putting the world together through experiencing every path is entirely for the benefit of whatever peace of mind you can get from doing so. And at the end of the day, what it did to me instead was grapple with one final question. Can the parts of us we most revile be beautiful? Beyond my need to be liked or my guilt and shame burned into my relationship with this part of my identity, taking the assumption that engaging in a community space when I was not ready to has in fact traumatized me, can that same space, and specifically my involvement in it, be a profound, beautiful, and good part of my life? This question is really tricky to work through because oftentimes the question of can pain be beautiful is raised, and the answer is, of course it can. Neither Echo nor Furries invented the concept of pain as beauty. Even back at the top of this essay, Majora's Mask, remember that? Is a game that, yes, scarred my childhood, but I've grown to love it and see the game's overall heart, and, it asks you to be kind to people, despite everything. That the world is ending, yes, but the world is full to bursting with vibrant characters, with passions and needs, and the game ultimately rallies you to resist the doom and gloom of the end. I'm instead asking if the specific act of growing up in a place that has almost provably done something bad to you, that has warped you around it, into it, until you've become linked to it immutably, can that be beautiful? And isn't that Echo? For the boundless capacity this game has to give pretty much every character room for nuance and complexity and flawed interiorities, Echo, the town itself, sits at the nexus of fucking evil in this game. Sam Ayers is the ghostly presence compelling chase around, making the socket man, sure, but it only works in Echo, and Echo has a whole other monster and a mirror man and hum, tulpas. This place is so thoroughly rotten to its core, and yet, everyone who lives here, who has lived here, has been so damaged by it and are themselves vibrant, complicated people. And that's what I'm feeling, right? I'm not a gay man who grew up in a small town, but my own fraught digital upbringing has also shaped me, and I, bafflingly, can see myself now as this mess of contradictions. My life has been shaped by this, for better and for worse. In seeking into this lake, in letting myself be consumed by this cozy, intricate language, to close my eyes and feel the choking smoke, the artificially cold, cavernous estate, the smothering heat on the trails, I, too, invite myself to a world that deals in secrets, to confront my own dependency, my own heartsick longings, my own inaction, my own angers and damning needs, and beyond all, knowing fully that there is no answer. I could have all the worries and fears and jealousies acted on in full, chase my old self forever, and I would never, ever be satisfied with what I found there. Ultimately, the worst part of this hell is knowing that all of this will never truly leave me. We all live with our ghostly pasts on some level. I live with my old self, my old voice, lingering in the corners of my mind, but for all of Echo's talk of circles, of never truly escaping yourself, I think what is also undeniably true is that you can never fully go back either. Look out across the sun-splintered lake where birds take flight across the vastness of the desert. The warm southern breeze lifting them and carrying them towards distant anywhere. You can see the places where the rains touch this place, the high watermark where all its waves have broken and rolled back for years, and now lay reflective and still in the settling evening. A clean spirit, parted from the misery and the terror, the weeping and the contortion, lifts up into the sky where now the stars begin to kindle, and the burning sun flees the restful replenishing night. See 6 figures in an old truck, driving out of town for the last time. Hear the little sigh each gives up, unnoticed by the others, as they pass beyond the threshold, and out of these and all other stories. It's not a happy ending, because nothing ends, but it is still and kind, and as the rising moon reveals, good. See them gone, cradled in a new twilight. Special thanks to Alexi Angelica, Caitlin Fisher, Colleen T., the Apartheid Emerald Magnate Recovery Fund, Gail Simmons, Joe Anderson, Lewis Wells, Low Rez, Maria Aladren, Mozzie VT, Naraya the Red Marked, Nomadic Raven, Professor Bopper, St. Rawberry, Thomas Volpez, and Satetic. Thank you all so much.